Hello everyone, and welcome to the very first video on making optimum health easy. We're really excited to bring you this information, and we've worked hard to get up to this point. So this is really where the rubber starts to meet the road, where we've taken knowledge that we've learned up to this point and really turned it into understanding so that we can inspire new action to make optimum health easy and make it easy for a lifetime. That's what this is really all about. And we're really going to start off with understanding where we are right now in the new world of food in the 21st century so that we can get some perspective on how our food has really changed over time. Then we're going to back it up a little bit and go back to food and diet in early human civilization and in early agriculture. So we can kind of get a little perspective here on how the food started to get to the point where we are today. And then we're going to back it all the way down to the Paleolithic era of food, reaching back hundreds of thousands of years. Now, before we get started with this, I just want to make sure that I'm adding this little bit of information for perspective. Now, we're going to be talking about Paleolithic food, the food that we've eaten since the very beginning of our existence up until just recently. But I don't want you to confuse this with just the paleo diet. In other words, I don't want you to think that we've been through all this and all these videos just so that we can push the paleo diet, because that's not at all what we're doing. This is, again, just to add perspective to the kind of food that we have always eaten, and the paleo diet is a separate subject. And what we're really trying to do here is use the information about what we ate during the Paleolithic time in our evolution to help us make better choices in the new world of food and the kind of food that's available today. So again, this is not just about the paleo diet. This is just about adding perspective. So let's go ahead and get into the content, starting again with food and diet in the 21st century. We're going to begin with understanding some of the markers that really are benchmarks of what is food in the 21st century, and again in what we call the new world of food. So agriculture in the 20th and 21st century started to show some major transformations to profit-driven motives that have really caused the fastest pace of food de-evolution that our species has ever experienced. And I'm using the word de-evolution here because that's really what's happened. We have made changes to our food faster in the last couple hundred years than at any other point in our history, and our bodies just haven't been able to keep up with the changes to that diet without having some serious problems, which of course we call health issues or ailments today. That started to really happen in the early 1900s when gasoline-powered vehicles began replacing farm animals. At that time, we also started to use chemical fertilizers for the very first time, and they were used extensively to increase yields on crops for a growing human population. Pesticides and fungicides and also ripening agents were developed and began to be used quite extensively. And then as we became more urbanized, as we began to lead busier lifestyles and we got concentrated into towns and cities, prepackaged foods, fast foods, and processed foods really began to emerge during this time, because this is a time in our development where we really began to spend more time in the industrial age at work and a lot less time actually preparing our own foods. And this is a big shift in how we have eaten in the past couple hundred years. Because we began to have these processed foods, we developed food preservatives and pasteurization to make food last longer on the shelf without spoilage. Now, this wasn't necessarily for anybody's benefit. It was to maintain profits, because right about this time, this is when we started to corporatize food. In other words, we really began to see food as a trading commodity and a way to make big money on Wall Street and in big business, or what we also call big ag or big agriculture. So this is the emergence of when food producers and farms really started to turn corporate. Instead of, as a consumer, instead of really knowing where our food came from and even probably knowing the farmer themselves, we started to buy brands. And these brands, get their food from the lowest bidder, from wherever it is that they can find them. So again, we lost touch with the farm, we lost touch with the farmer, and we started buying brands. Now, this is also about the time that we started with food extracts like high fructose corn syrup and monosodium glutamate. And these were developed to put in just about any type of processed food as a cheap alternative to cane sugar and other natural products. They were especially added to foods that became low fat or fat free because of the low fat revolution that we talked about in a previous video. And when we take the fat out of foods, they taste terrible. And so we add high fructose corn syrup and other cheap alternatives to these foods to make them palatable, to make them taste better. And of course, nothing adds to your waistline more than these sugary food extracts. During this time, food corporations also began growing in political power and in the money they were able to throw around, especially with the FDA and other government institutions, to pass laws that enhanced profits and benefited them, but not necessarily benefited any of us as the consumer. And so I think at this point our health really also deteriorated as a result of laws being passed to protect big agriculture businesses and not necessarily being passed for the health of the people. Food corporations back in the 1990s also started to produce genetically modified organisms or genetically modified foods, thus owning life and owning crops. And again, this is for enhanced profits so that the food companies can actually own these foods. GMOs were then allowed into our food supply with really minimal understanding of the impacts to human health and the environment. And even though genetically modified foods are banned in most countries worldwide today, they're allowed to grow unbridled here in America. And further, the same companies that produce these GMO foods also have worked hard at resisting the labeling of genetically modified foods despite public support for the contrary. Most of the informed public wants GMO labeling, but the food companies have made sure that they don't have to go down that road. Another big marker too of the new world of food is factory farmed meats and how this has drastically changed the nutritional and fat profile of the meats, leading to a huge health disaster in our country today. And we talked a little bit about that in the video on fats, and we're going to be talking about it more in a video to come that is specific to grass-fed meats. See, the grass-fed meats that humans have always eaten have significantly more nutrition, less saturated fat, and a great ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids. That's simply this. Factory farm meats do not have those features, and that is a huge problem and a big disaster for our health. Next, food companies also got smarter with their food advertisements, and they aimed their food advertisements at every demographic available. It's led us down a path of eating for profit and convenience rather than for health. These same food advertisements had us all believing too that fat makes us fat, so they can sell the low-fat food items and fill us full of sugars and high fructose corn syrup and other sweeteners that actually do terrible things to our health. Food companies began advertisements aimed specifically also at children to influence the eating habits for entire generations for purposes of profit. And food companies also began influencing entire networks of nutritionists and dietitians and even the medical industry, along with paid talent like celebrities to work behind the scenes and influence the perception of their products in a positive light. Food companies also funded studies that were supportive of their products and did everything that they could to discredit any evidence that opposed their products or painted their products in a bad light. All of this to have us believe that a highly processed, frozen weight loss TV dinner is somehow good for us. And then the final marker I'd like to cover for food in the 21st century and the new world of food is grain and processed-based foods that cause significant weight gain in people, all for profit, and the emergence of fad diet plans, along with the pharmaceutical weight loss solutions that grow up around it to further enhance profits for entire generations of people. Now that we've gone through the markers of food in the 21st century, what we call the new world of food, let's back up just a little bit and talk about food and diet during early human civilization and agriculture. Now, this began about 10,000 years ago when human beings began to transition from a purely hunter-gatherer lifestyle to one of agriculture. Now, when this first began, there were cultures that were still hunter-gatherers. Indeed, even today in the 21st century, there are still hunter-gatherer societies. So we began to slowly develop agriculture in isolated pockets. This was marked by the use of domesticated plants and animals. So this is when we started to selectively breed plants and animals for specific traits. Now, early on, some of the crops that were grown were fig trees, flax, ancient wheats, and barley. And this all happened mainly in the Near East. In other parts of the world, there were also potatoes, millet, avocados, bananas, rice, beans, and squash, just to name a few. Now, around 7,000 to 9,000 BC, we also started milking animals and consuming milk during that time. Now, this is the emergence of when humans first started to see lactose, and we started to develop some traits to tolerate lactose in our diet. Now, back in those days, the herdsmen and tribal peoples that just began agriculture began moving their animals to fresh grasses that were available to help those animals become healthy, or rotating pastures as well, to keep their farm animals fed with native and natural diets. Now, at this time, all of the food that was eaten by these early agricultural civilizations were still considered organic foods, wild caught fish, and grass-fed meats. And of course, there was no genetic modification, at least no genetically modified lab-created foods in existence. The only modifications that were made were some crossbreedings of some plants and animals to produce the best traits. All the meats that were eaten with all the fats and the cholesterol along with it. People thrived at this time without obesity and with other modern health afflictions that are common today. Now that we've been through 21st century era food, and we know that it is genetically modified, it's sprayed down with poisons, we're factory farming our meats. And we've also talked about early human civilization and agriculture, where we started to farm, we started to raise animals for consumption and also for milk. But those animals were raised on pasture, and herdsmen and tribesmen moved those animals from pasture to pasture for their optimum health, where they would find natural foods, and that all of that helped to improve the health of the people who ate those animals and plants at that time, because everything was considered what we would call today organic and grass-fed meats. Now let's back up even further than that. Let's talk about the Paleolithic era of food, the food that I'm going to say, in my opinion, the food that we are designed to eat for optimum health. Now let's talk about why this is. This era of the way we have always eaten started, from what we can tell, about 2.6 million years ago up until about 12,000 years ago, just about the time that we started into our agricultural lifestyle. So just to do some simple math here, we're talking about 10,000 years we've been eating more and more of an agricultural based diet. But for 2.6 million years, a majority of the time that we've been on this planet, we have eaten in a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, otherwise known as the Paleolithic Era of Food. Now, human genetics have been selected to be successful in a hunter-gatherer type of a society lifestyle. And our genetics today are virtually identical to our ancestors of 120,000 years ago. So if our ancestors of 120,000 years ago are essentially the same as we are today, then we have changed our diet drastically in a very, very short period of time over the past few hundred years and beginning over the last 10,000 years with agriculture. So most of our time on this planet has been spent in a hunter-gatherer type of lifestyle. So various location-based human nutritional needs and genetic adaptations from around the world have created different groups of people depending upon where we resided on the planet. And in other words, we have had genetic adaptations to the types of foods and plants available to us depending on where we live. And some of these variations include things like soil composition, availability of different plant-based and meat-based foods, adaptations for temperature and even sunlight exposure. And this leads to a genetic uniqueness of how different nutrients are processed by people of different backgrounds even today. This is why each one of us can no longer outsource our health to other people or to special interests. In other words, it's really important that we take sovereign, complete control over our health permanently for the rest of our lives and in our own way, depending on our family background and in a number of other factors as well. So if we have always been hunter-gatherers, if our genetics are virtually the same as our ancestors of 120,000 years ago, and those people of 120,000 years ago were all hunter-gatherers, then it would make a lot of sense for us to understand what does it mean to be a hunter-gatherer. And so let's go ahead and explore some of these aspects. Let's look at the hunter aspect of a hunter-gatherer first. Now, human beings have always hunted and harvested meats, whether that be elk or deer or seal meat or fish or the gathering of eggs. We took whatever it is that we had access to, depending on our geographic perspective on where our ancestors lived on the planet. Now, here's the big distinction. We have a name today for the kind of meat that we have always eaten, regardless of the variation of that meat. And the name that we give it today is organic grass-fed / free range and wild caught if it's fish. Now that's a big distinction because that's a difference of organic grass-fed versus conventional. And again, we're going to say this and we're going to go into detail on this in a future video, but the difference between organic grass-fed and conventionally raised meat has significant differences in the types and amounts of fat and minerals and trace minerals and vitamins. And that is a huge deviation of diet for human beings since we have been on this planet, and why our bodies just can't keep up with the changes and creates a lot of health problems. So organic grass-fed meat or a wild-caught fish is what we also would call today a premium food option. In other words, we go to the grocery store and this is premium. It's usually more expensive than conventional meats, but keep something in mind here. Premium foods have always been the very bare minimum of level of expectation that our bodies have always had for the types of foods that we've always eaten. So even though we give it a name of premium and grass-fed meat, it really is the minimum level of expectation in order to maintain optimum health. Now let's take a look at the gatherer aspect of the hunter-gatherer. We have always gathered any edible vegetation and medicinals from our surroundings based upon where we are geographically on the planet that we would have had access to. This would have included things like leafy greens, fruits and vegetables, roots, nuts, seeds, herbs, and medicinals. And other miscellaneous things too, like honey. We've also, cultivated honey whenever we had access to it. Now, once again, just like before, we have a name today for the kind of vegetation that we've always eaten, and that is organic or non-GMO. In other words, our ancestors did not eat lab-created, genetically modified food sprayed down with poisons and pesticides, otherwise consume any pesticide residues. And that, again, is a big deviation from the kind of foods that we've always had throughout our entire existence on this planet. Now let's continue on to another important topic, and that is water. Our ancestors drank water. And there's also plenty of evidence, of course, too, that they made herbal and medicinal teas, but still, water was the basis of what they drank. Certainly not processed beverages, heavily laden with sugar or artificial sweeteners or artificial anything. But more important than that is that the water that our ancestors have always had access to did not have industrial chemical runoff in the water like our water does today coming out of the tap. This includes things like petrochemicals, pharmaceutical residues that make its way into our water supplies that our water purification treatment facilities just can't filter out. We're going to have more on this a little bit later on. And another interesting topic too about water is certainly our ancestors did not have any access to the plastics and the plastic chemicals leaching into our water from plastic containers. Those are hormone disruptors and do a lot of terrible things to our health that, again, our ancestors never had to deal with. Another aspect of our Paleolithic history is fitness, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about this later on too. But there's two things that I really want to go over with fitness, and one of them is that studies have shown that our ancestors had significantly more leisure time than we do today, with a lot lower daily stress levels. And so managing stress levels is going to be an important aspect of our ancestral health. But more than that, our ancestors never had gym memberships. But even though they didn't have gyms, they remained fit. And they did so with simple daily movements. Think about what our ancestors must have done. Certainly they walked and ran and jumped and swimming, lifting things, throwing things, pushing and pulling. These are just basic human physical movements that are natural for us. And it's easy to do those types of things even today, either with or without a gym, that can help us become much more healthy in combination with eating correctly. Our ancestors also had no multivitamins. They didn't have any protein shakes or blenders or juicers or anything along those lines, but yet still remained healthy. And one of the aspects that we're going to be talking about later on as well is that the foods that were available to our ancestors were oftentimes more dense in nutrition than our foods are today, because of our agricultural lifestyle today. We have depleted soil issues that deprives much of the food that we have today of nutrients, and we're just not getting the same levels of nutrients that I think our ancestors probably had access to. So to add some perspective here, what is missing from our Paleolithic era of food? From what we can tell, grains were not totally absent from our ancestors' diets, but were minimal. We didn't typically eat a whole lot in the way of grains. Now, when you think about grains like wheats and things like that, those are grasses, and human beings don't really eat grass. The wheats that we did have access to were of the ancient wheat variety and were not prominent in their diet at that time from what we can tell. Yet today, of course, wheat-based products are very prominent in our diet and represent a big change. And as we discussed in a previous video, these grains spike our blood sugar levels that could lead to diabetes, and a host of other problems as well. Our ancestors also did not have any processed foods. They didn't have any filler foods, like pasta, and again, that's a grain-based type of a thing. But the foods they ate were whole foods of meats, vegetables, fruits, and other real foods that we eat so much less of because we eat so much processed foods in today's new world of food. Our ancestors also had no access to artificial colors and sweeteners. They didn't have any access to processed sugars. They certainly didn't have any access to trans fats or any lab-created fats. They had no vegetable oils. They had no grain-fed meats. They had no meats with added hormones and antibiotics. They had no genetically modified foods. Also absent was petroleum-based fertilizers, synthetic chemicals, plastics, and plastic chemicals leaching into our food and also into our water. Certainly our ancestors did not produce food or gather food based upon profits or any type of corporate drive or initiatives. They did so to eat well, to survive from day to day. And certainly our ancestors had no access to a low-fat or a fat-free food. They did not have access to diet plans. And that is why I advocate so strongly that even today, we do not need diet plans. We do not need to count calories. If we eat like our ancestors did, we simply won't need to do it. And that is what this is all about. So in summary, let's cover what makes us healthy from the perspective of a Paleolithic and early agricultural lifestyle, and how we can apply that to food in the 21st century or the new world of food. We now know that whole foods, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, leafy greens, roots, organic grass-fed meats, wild-caught fish, free-range eggs, everything being organic, fats coming from natural sources like coconuts, avocados, meats, and of course, coconut oil and olive oil or fruit-based oils are definitely the way to go if we want optimum health in the new world of food. Foods that don't contribute to optimum health, and based on everything that we've talked about, are processed foods and vegetable oils, a really high intake of grain and grain-based foods. We certainly don't want any processed sugars. We don't want any preservatives, artificial ingredients, or colors, or MSGs, or high fructose corn syrup. None of those things drive health, obviously. We want to stay away from genetically modified foods and GMOs. We want to stay away from factory farmed meats. That's a huge deviation from the types of foods that our ancestors have always had access to. And we want to reduce or eliminate our exposure to synthetic chemicals and hormones and toxins in general that are used in the production of the new world of food today. So to make this all really, really simple, organic grass-fed meats, wild-caught fish, organic fruits and vegetables, and reduce your dependency on grain is a way to get started with optimum health. By eating these whole foods, by eating grass-fed meats, by eating fruits and vegetables, by switching from vegetable oils to fruit oils like coconut and olive, right off the bat, we're going to stabilize blood sugar levels without even having to try. We're going to get the right fats, and we're going to get them at the right ratios without us even having to try. We're going to reduce our sodium intake. We're going to increase the nutritional levels. We're going to reduce exposure to toxins without us having to do anything or to even think about it. You're going to right-size blood pressure, and you're going to right-size your blood work. You're going to stabilize cholesterol levels and so much more. Your skin will clear up. Your health will improve. You'll feel better. You'll lose weight. All of these surface level goals that we talked about in our previous videos take care of themselves without us even having to think about it or try. Knowing this information can change the kind of foods that you purchase at the grocery store. You might even change your grocery store from the one that you've typically gone to a locally owned health food store, which is the way my wife and I shop. We shop almost exclusively at locally owned health food stores that specialize in local, organic, and grass-fed meats. That concludes this very first section on Making Optimum Health Easy. Understanding how food has changed and how it has evolved into the corporate-based, profit-driven motives that we have in the new world of food today in the 21st century. In the next videos coming up, we're going to be talking about the difference between organic and conventional foods. We're going to be talking about the difference between grass-fed meats versus just organic meats and conventional meats. We're going to be talking about water and how to purify your water, not filter your water, but purify your water. There is a difference, and so much more. This is where the rubber really meets the road. This is where we make things simple, and we're really glad that you guys are along for the ride. So we'll see you at the next video.